Hello there, and welcome to another interesting episode of the interview. Today, I'm so delighted to have Dr. Robert Kim, who is an assistant professor of applied theology and church planting, and also the Philip and Rebecca Douglas Chair of Church Planting and Christian Formation at Covenant Theological Seminary, located at St. Louis in Missouri. I'm so delighted to have you join me today for this wonderful conversation, Dr. Rob.
Thank you, Seth, for inviting me. It's good to be with you again, especially since we haven't been with one another in some time.
Yeah. And let me say here that Pastor Rob, I call him Pastor Rob. He was my pastor at some point. So he's somebody that I know closely. He's a very wonderful person, and he does a lot of great things. And he's an orator, as you will soon find out. So I hope we'll be able to keep up with the pace as we start the conversation. So we want to have, conversation. Most of our conversation today will revolve around, this issue of racism, especially looking at the American context and, of course, applying it to the world at large. Racism is one of the thorny issues that America and other parts of the world have been dealing with for centuries. Even in the 21st century, it is disheartening that issues of racial tensions, prejudices, and antagonism are still with us. Generally, Black people have often been at the receiving end of racism, especially in America. But the recent happenings among the Asian American and Pacific Islanders population in America in the past couple of months have exposed the other aspect of racism that you often don't hear about. You are a second-generation Korean American. I just want to ask you, have you ever personally encountered cases of racism? And if so, do you mind sharing some of your experiences?
Yeah, thank you for asking that again, Seth. I think, the reality amongst what's happened over the last year or so with the pandemic has only increased what I think a lot of people have simply have known and expected to happen amongst Asian Americans. Again, the most recent one being the Atlanta shootings. Yesterday, there was another incident that was caught in New York that was equally as kind of disheartening. For me personally, it was probably perhaps fascinating was on the day that I shared with our faculty, just to pray on behalf of the API community. I shared that I took my son to get vaccinated, and in doing so, he was called a racial slur. And so it was a very fresh kind of moment and part of kind of our story. I think for me personally, throughout my life, it hasn't been per se like one specific like major traumatic incident, but I think a series of just kind of whether it be viewed as less than, viewed not as quote unquote American, not being completely fully human, not having the sense of home. All those things have been kind of part of it. And then there's always been kind of your traditional kind of racial slurs that have been mentioned here and there, I think, amongst the Asian American community. What I think is perhaps unfortunate right now is just beginning to happen, I think, in the United States context is race has always been viewed, race and racism has often been viewed much more from a black-white history rather than seeing the much larger narrative. And, I would also want to bring in our Hispanic and Latino brothers and sisters for the same reason, that I think they would echo the same sentiment that racism goes across all different forms of strides within the American landscape that oftentimes goes untold. And it'd be not great, but it'd be good to make sure that we note of the fact that this has actually been part of the story and that we would actually try to correct it, especially from the response of the church, which oftentimes hasn't done a good job with it.
Yeah, the next question I had for you, which I think you have kind of answered in part, is what do you make of the recent happenings in the United States from George Floyd to the attacks on innocent people in the AAIP communities?
Yeah, you can't really make sense of it because you would think that history would not repeat itself for so long. I think if we use the old proverb that says, what's the definition of insanity? To do the same thing and expect different results. It's kind of been that with respect to kind of how we've behaved as a culture. Racial tensions amongst the African Americans being documented for so long. George Floyd just being another kind of stab in the midst of all the things that kind of erupted into kind of national protesting, et cetera, and things like that. The sad reality, obviously, amongst our African American brothers and sisters is that, that's just been a daily lived in reality. I co-teach a class here at Covenant Seminary with an African American brother named Dr. Higgins, and I conceptualized this class specifically because I wanted to bring two people of color, the Asian American and then the African American context together. And I'll just share you kind of one of the conversations that we've had with one another. We were debating back and forth. He was saying, I think it's harder to be an Asian American in America than it is to be an African American. I just said, I don't think that's the case because of the fact that we haven't nearly faced as much of, let's say, the life and death issues. And I think even with Atlanta, it's perhaps more than one of the first well-known kind of stories where it seems as though it was racially motivated, targeted for that from a national landscape. And as such, we've kind of gone back and forth. And I'm just simply saying, no, I think amongst the African-American brothers and sisters, their plight has been one that I do want to continue to have not only sympathy and compassion for, but want to advocate on their behalf. But what I think I also appreciate about this moment is, in light of Atlanta, we're seeing not just Asian Americans or API folk step up and say, hey, we belong here. We're as American as anyone else is. And this idea of or prejudice or hate against Asian Americans is not accepted. But it's also been great to see that other people of color who have understood the same plight have joined in that cause, saying that hate has no place. It does not belong within our culture, especially, again, like I said, amongst kind of the nationalistic / Christian mindset that oftentimes gets conflated with that. I think what we're making of it is that it's just beginning to surface some of the many things that have been there for so long. And again, I'm still waiting for the church to have a better and a more appropriate response to the injustices that people face on behalf of their skin.
You were a pastor for more than 20 years, I should say, before transitioning to the academic setting. Do you think that the church has in some way contributed to propagating racism, especially in the United States?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. I think I think there's a more extensive answer, unfortunately. But when I say that is, one of the things that we're seeing right now is the rise of Christian nationalism, which, if I were to contrast a little bit, Seth, with your cultural context, I don't think you necessarily have that. But we're here in America, you definitely have this idea to say we're a Christian nation. To be quote unquote American is to be Christian. And that conflation has not necessarily helped the church. In fact, I would argue that it's really brought us back. So we saw this, for example, with the January 6th Capitol riots, where people were, carrying signs saying that Jesus saves, and yet they're rioting and they're doing all these different things, and quote unquote, in the name of Jesus. We saw that true historically, even with the Ku Klux Klan, and many of them did the same exact thing, that they thought of it as a quote unquote Christian agenda. I think, missionally speaking, from the context of the church, one of the things we teach here is this idea that the church is engaged on mission, or, doing some form of missional improvisation. And as such, the church has sometimes done their part in acting on behalf of God in a way that does honor him and do the way that we're supposed to be. And yet in many ways, and we can see this even, I would say, arguably in the role of the Crusades historically as well, that the church sometimes in the name of Christ have not done things well. I think more recently with respect to racism, I think even the fact that here in America, we see that, what's been said, at least until the early 1900s, where they've said, the Sunday morning worship hour is the most segregated hour in America, that still hasn't changed in over 100 years. I think there's some blame, or at least some issue there, to be able to say that the church hasn't sought to ask themselves, why is it that we continue to remain homogenous in some way, or remain homogenous in some way, shape, or form, rather than at least asking the question, are we able to reflect the communities by which our churches or our bodies of worship exist in? And so for me personally, I just think that the church bears some responsibility with respect to not trying to engage in that conversation well enough. And again, if you're in an area where it's just predominantly homogenous, I don't expect that church to be heterogeneous in any way, shape, or form. But I think if you're asking the question of, if you're engaging your community that happens to be across, ethnic and cultural lines, the question should be is, why do our churches not reflect that at the same time?
Why do our churches not reflect, the diversity that we see in the community, in the larger society? So in essence, what you're saying is that the church has not been doing enough to curb this issue of racism in America.
Yeah, and it's a sad reality that I think, Mark Dimas, who talks about multi-ethnic churches, he says, I think it's around 15% of churches can claim that they have a 20% variance, right? So meaning that if you've gone past a 20% variance of some kind of cultural ethnic identity, then you can be considered multi-ethnic or multicultural. And yet the minority of churches reach that threshold, which to me, that threshold is pretty small, right? 20% is not that significant. And it's just unfortunate that the majority of churches, something to the effect of 85% of churches, I think in America, aren't even reaching that threshold of 20%. And so, again, I think we continue to propagate a model of church that continues to say we're going to just continue the same patterns of what we think we are, which I think goes back to the question of why do churches exist? It's not because of our skin color. And I say this in regards to, for me as a second generation Korean American, I think as I began to quote unquote grow in my understanding of church, yes, I'm ethnically Korean, but my missional background and understanding who I could engage was no longer limited because of my language or my culture or my skin. I could engage anyone who was quote unquote English speaking because that's the language, primary language that I spoke. And therefore, I think even as you were able to witness, Seth, in terms of being part of our church, is we really sought to be a multi-ethnic, multicultural church and not say that, our ethnicity is what binds us together, but really in essence that we're coming together under what I would argue truly should be is that under the name of Jesus, that's the reason why we're gathered, not because of this color of our skin.
Do you think that sometimes the language that the church uses, kind of fuels some of these racial tensions in the society?
I think it can for sure, because, I think when it comes down to when people speak about this. So, for example, right now in America, if you use the phrase Black Lives Matter or you use the phrase woke, I think people can have an adverse reaction to that. You'll see a polarization. And this goes, I think, beyond what you're asking, Seth, but because I think it's also speaking to kind of our political landscape, that we can't be around people that we disagree with, which is a complete side story, which we won't go to. But I'll just simply say that I think it's charged more than just that. But the fact that it's that polarizing, I think, shows how divisive the church can be. And I think if anything during this pandemic, I don't know about you, but when I've talked to pastors and Christian leaders at this time, they're saying their difficulty right now is that they can't get their church unified on simple things like whether it be wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, yet alone trying to do bigger issues. Like, for example, do you agree that racism exists and that the church should have a response to that? Some churches that dare to do that have been viewed as Marxists. And so therefore, pastors are sometimes afraid to say that they want to bring up the cultural issue. Some that do it, again, will maybe say, I'm not being conservative enough. So they feel like, well, I can't bring it up because I'm going to lose part of the congregation. So I think there's a lot of fear and timidity in regards to trying to address the issues of today at the same time.
Some people argue that, why they go to churches that they find people that look more like them is because they feel more comfortable. And if they find themselves in a church setting that, they are different, they feel uncomfortable. And to some extent, some people have also heard the argument that people say, well, we don't, necessarily welcome. Well, they may not say that bluntly, but that they don't really welcome people that look differently than them. On the guys that the pastor may tell you something like, well, we don't want to create a situation where we will make our members uncomfortable. What do you make of that type of argument, that type of logic?
Seth, I lost you for 1 second. Are we back?
Okay, yes, we're back. So the point I was making is that, some people, make the argument that they being in a certain where they are different, it makes them feel uncomfortable with the situation. And to some extent, some pastors have also argued that why they don't talk about cultural issues, why they don't talk about racial integration in the context of the church is because if you start bringing other people that look different, it's going to make their members feel uncomfortable. So they don't want to put their members in that situation that will make them uncomfortable. What do you make of that type of logic?
Yeah, and so I'm citing a little bit of the idea of the homogeneous unit principle, which I think you're well familiar with in terms of missiological circles. But I think that's just it. Most people want to be in settings in which there's homogeneity. We're naturally prone to do that. I think Jesus himself spoke to this when he, if you remember that episode where he's talking in terms of saying, what good is it if you love those who would love you without the gospel? Even non-Christians can do that, or even people who don't believe can believe that, right? He said, but the test of the gospel is when you can do things like love your enemies and be congregated together with your enemies. So, on a somewhat anecdotal line in terms of just our family, my wife, one minute, and I, we're kind of polar opposites in personalities. And so in some ways we kind of say, if it wasn't for Jesus, we shouldn't be together. And that's kind of the beauty of the covenant of marriage. But I think that's an anecdote for also the church, which is also called the bride of Christ. So I think there's this marriage kind of component to it, which is I think the people within the walls of the church should kind of marvel and say, you know what, if it wasn't for the reconciling work of Jesus, we probably shouldn't be in this room together. In fact, we should probably hate each other. And I think going back to where the North American church has sometimes fallen prey to is we've kind of said, well, homogeneity, that's what we're after, because that's low-hanging fruit. It's easy to gather people that are like one another, because again, you actually don't need the gospel. You don't need the compelling transforming nature of the gospel to do so. But if you gather people that, again, were polar opposites on, let's say, whether it be theological issues, racial divide issues, socioeconomic levels, et cetera, and things like that, there's something really compelling about the witness of the church. And I think even today in the North American context, I think that's one of the reasons why there's a lack of kind of people's motivation to see that the church is a compelling witness of the gospel today. It's often, again, been something that said, they gather because, they're a country club, or they're all the same, right? And so again, it's kind of that thing. Whereas not to be able to say, man, there's something really mystical or something really powerful when you have two people that, again, should be enemies, and yet they call themselves brothers and sisters to one another. And they're able to love one another, all the one another's of Scripture, to do that to one another at the same time.
You mentioned the concept of homogeneity. I know you train as a sociologist in the university. How does the concept of homogeneity, comport with the church in the New Jerusalem that we see in the book of Revelation?
Well, I think that's what's beautiful, right? In Revelation, we see every tribe, nation, and tongue gathered under the thing. The very diversity of the kingdom is the very thing we so desire and aspire to hopefully reflect. And that's where, again, so you can't do anything but not reflect your community. So again, if you're living in an area where there is no racial and ethnic diversity, your test there often is just a reflection of your community amongst other culture groups. So for example, if it's most communities will have something in terms of socioeconomic diversity. And I've argued, for example, that to me is equal a challenge as the racial ethnic diversity that I think churches should seek after. So for example, if you have a community where there's the extremely rich and the extreme poor, how do you bring them together to be able to do life with one another? And I think going back to your point on the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth, in terms of what Revelation speaks of every tribe, nation, and tongue, the idea of homogeneity really speaks against that, right? It's the complete opposite of that. Every tribe, nation, and tongue is to be able to see that, when we think about the kingdom of God being much broader than any singular nation, which going back to even Christian nationalism, again, the comporting of ideas there will be is that, the kingdom of God looks like us and only us, rather than saying, oh no, the kingdom of God is much bigger than just us. Case in point, one of the things I argue for a lot of times in my classes here is to say, the North America, U.S. context has never been the center of Christianity historically. And yet too often Christian nationalism has kind of promoted this idea to think that we are it and we produce everything that kind of quote unquote is good and Christian. But that's never been the case, right? And even right now in 2021, it's still not the case. And I think we need to kind of have this humble posture of realizing where we stand as a church. And in that humble posture, I think we would actually correct some of the narratives that are false in terms of what's leading and guiding the church today.
When you were my pastor, one of the things that you always spoke about was this concept of the Imago Dei. You have always talked about the Imago Dei as the central theological concept and something that should help us in issues like this that we're talking about today. How does our understanding of the Imago Dei help us to deal with racism?
Yeah. You're speaking a language I do a lot right now, even at the school. And so I will say thank you for that. You know, fundamentally, as the biblical story starts in Genesis, and the fact that we're created in the image of God, justly deserving dignity, value, and worth, and nothing robs us from that. Even sin doesn't rob us from that. There's a distortion, we could say, of the image of God, but it doesn't rob us of the very image of God that's found within us. One of the arguments that we cite here is an argument that Mao had with a man named Yoder in regards to kind of this distinction of, you know, what is more theologically accurate? Is it created but fallen, or fallen but created? And one of the things that we argue in the midst of that is to say, you know, by changing it one way or the other, we'll often change our posture as we look toward humanity and look toward one another. And so, for example, if we start with what I think has been more the mindset of fallen but created, we look out towards people, whether it be racial issues, et cetera, and things like that, and what we see is fallenness. We're like, oh, they're a bad culture, or they're a bad racial group, or we can, again, go to other even sinful habits or tendencies. They're bad people. Rather than, again, seeing the image of God within them, to say, no, they were actually created but fallen. So created means that we start in that posture to be able to say, how do I actually see the image of God within them? And that because nothing can rob them of it, we try to engage with, again, the dignity, value, and worth that God has already bestowed on them as image bearers. I do think as we look at some of the cultural issues of our times, again, I could go through race and ethnicity. We could talk about age. I could talk about even gender issues. That oftentimes what is going on is a robbing of someone's humanity or dignity of the Imago Dei by seeing them less than. So, for example, the George Floyd issues are an Imago Dei issue because it's a treatment of seeing an image bearer as less than. You wouldn't treat part of God's creation in light of in that view if you saw them as being made in the image of God. The same thing for Asian women who are rectified as, you know, sex objects. You know, the whole idea of porn is really, in essence, to say that you don't see more of them, you actually see less of them because you don't see the image of God within them. So I do think that this idea of the Imago Dei does run rampant. And I think if the church were to even regain some of that, to be able to start with saying, no, how do I see all of creation, all of my fellow mankind, as being created in the image of God, and therefore, if it's due that dignity, value, and respect, that we begin to kind of build those relationships across those things. I think, sadly, you know, one thing about racial and ethnic lines is most people will say that they haven't developed significant relationships across racial lines. And to me, I think that surely, and these are Christian leaders, right, who will often say, if I look at the majority of my quote unquote friendship group or my social groups, they tend to remain homogenous. And so even there, I think there's this challenge to be able to say, how do we begin to see the image of God within all of humanity and to go across and build those bridges accordingly?
What's your message to minority groups, especially in the United States, given the current climate of racial tensions?
I think there's a lot of messages I think you can give. One is oftentimes within the context of being marginalized within our culture. You know, I think we can prefer sometimes to be not seen. And so rather than trying to maybe perhaps stay within the margins, to be able to adjust and be able to say, you know, I'm here, I'm seen, and to be able to come together. I think part of that is to say that they're countering a message that often says you are less than. And so, for example, if in America, where the majority white culture says, you know, to be white is normal and to be anything else is less than normal, I think the message to minorities is to say, no, you're fully viewed and valued and loved just the way you are, and to be able to actually bring more of your culture, not less of your culture. So, for example, I know that a lot of Asian Americans struggle with this idea of ethnic identity, to say if they've quote unquote made it, they would seemingly be more quote unquote white. Where I would challenge to say, if you've made it, it's actually to be who you are and how God has fashioned you to be, and not to kind of take yourself away from the table, but to rather instead bring more of yourself to the table in that particular way. The last thing, maybe just as an exhortation, is what I said earlier about this coming together as people of color. I do think that there's a strong resonance of when you realize you're the minority, and I'm going to use an illustration from a Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, and more so from the movie. But if you've watched the movie with your kids, Seth, it's a story of like tiny people that live on a flower, or like a flower. But it's when their voices come together and saying, we are here, that they're able to be heard and to be saved. And the reason why I like that analogy is because I think sometimes as one individual or even just one ethnic group, so for example, this past weekend, a bunch of API communities, Christian leaders came together for different rallies throughout cities in the United States. And I thought it was great because they said, hey, let's collaborate, let's come together. But one of the things I'm trying to do even here on Covenant's campus is to bring together all the people of color so that we can kind of have just a dialogue with one another. So it's not just separate by Asian American, African American, Latino. The video say, let's all come together and realize what's been kind of our struggle, what's been our plight, and how do we kind of work out of this from a gospel standpoint. So there's strength in numbers, there's strengths in being together. Your voice is louder, and your voice matter, you matter, right? Is one of those messages, I think, for minorities in this country.
So powerful. I want us to kind of switch gears to talk about missions. You are the chair of church planting and Christian formation at Covenant Theological Seminary. What are some of the challenges of missions in the contemporary time? You may want to tie that up, this whole discussion about mission with the previous discussion.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely relate a little bit to church planting, which is to say, going back to what I cited earlier about the majority of churches still remaining predominantly homogenous in some way, shape, or form. I do hope and pray that the next wave of church planting, which I'm encouraging our students to do, is to catch a vision toward multi-ethnic, multicultural churches, so that can be part of it, that the witness of the gospel actually says the great reconciler of all humanity and all things through the work of Jesus Christ is actually going to be demonstrated in the work of the church as well. And so I would love to see that to be able to happen. I think, with the pandemic, and I'll maybe switch gears completely. And it's just a conversation I just had with a student here a second ago. The pandemic is causing a lot of people to pause and say, there's so much uncertainty right now. There's uncertainty as to, when the virus will be released and when people can kind of get back to normal. There's uncertainty as to like the economic conditions, as to whether churches will rebound. There's uncertainty whether or not churches in America. So for example, Barna came out with research saying that 1 out of 5 churches probably will not survive the pandemic. And so we see all these kind of, negative, gloom and doom things. And so people are saying, well, let's not engage in mission. Let's wait till we're done and we'll come out and then we'll reassess and we'll do it. My challenge has been is that I don't think we have that time and that luxury to be able to do so. I think even as I think about church planting, which is just part of missions, well, when I think about church planting specifically, it's people say we need to begin to start planting those churches now, because again, the need was greater before and it's only expanded as a result of the pandemic. And so we don't have that luxury abilities. We don't have the luxury to wait, because the reality is the pandemic has caused a lot of trauma that we don't even know and haven't assessed nearly to the extent that we can, again, socioeconomically, spiritually, et cetera. And so the reality is that the church needs to be there like frontline workers. And so as we're seeing that with medical workers, so likewise for the church and the mission of God to unfold in a way that we're ready to meet the needs of the pandemic. I think it was Andy Crouch who said this in regards to like what will be the new apologetic will be care, right? And I think there's some truth to that, right? Which is to say, how we will care for those who are hurting most as a result of this is one of those things. And again, maybe the challenge I'm saying is we don't have the luxury to wait. We have to begin to think about that now, because we know that trauma is coming soon, right? And if the church can respond faithfully to be, again, the body of Christ, right, which is to say that we're ready to meet the needs of this world, that we begin to mobilize now. We can't wait for that later.
That is so powerful. I love that statement that one of the things that the church needs to do is care, because a lot of people need care right now. You kind of answered this, my next question, but I will still ask it if there is something you want to add to what you have said previously. The pandemic undeniably seems to have changed our understanding of church planting, differently from what has been traditionally done over the years. What are some of the things that we have been learning for the past couple of months?
Yeah, so I just read an article about a church who planted during the pandemic, and I think it's just a great story of resiliency and adjustment. One of the things, that I mentioned in the podcast to someone on a different call was just, right when the pandemic hit, the reality was every church kind of felt like they were a church plant. And I think what we've seen over the past year is to see what churches have been nimble and kind of flexible enough to be able to reiterate. So, for example, like if your entire mindset as church before was come to our worship, come to our building, we will serve you, you can grow, you can give, we can do mission, et cetera, and things like that. A lot of churches were stalled, and they just simply said, we don't know what to do. We don't even know how to do, for example, an online service. We saw that in a lot of different traditions. People were like, I have an adamant rejection against anyone who's doing something online because I believe in, embodiment and people of place. But with the pandemic, everyone was forced to go into an online thing. So the almost interesting reality is those who were very staunchly against it were least prepared for what was to come with the pandemic. And those that were perhaps maybe already doing things like multi-campus online streaming, et cetera, and things like that, were already ready for it. I think one of the things that the pandemic has revealed is that the church always should have been flexible to meet the demands of what our present needs, or what the present needs of the culture are asking. And I think the pandemic only exposed, again, those churches that were willing to be able to say, to what degree do we hold on to, yes, confessional truths that are timed once and for all down to the saints, and those that are willing to say, but the means by which we deliver that needs to be flexible and adaptable. Ed Stetzer, who does a lot of missiological thinking, I love one thing that he's been saying in different kind of gatherings is, in the pandemic, one of the things we've been identifying is we call it a temporary, he calls it a temporary deficient ecclesiology for the purpose of mission. And I think there's some truth to that, which is to say that even in there, that idea of flexibility is you're probably going to have to let go of some things, not because they will remain permanent, but because of the fact that we needed to in order to engage the mission that's right in front of us. And yet at the same time, considering how at some point those temporary things will not be permanent, so therefore we're going to adjust back as a result after that. I don't think a lot of people have adopted that. So some people came into the pandemic, again, this goes into a little bit the polarization thing. They said, nope, I'm going to be faithful and true. This is how we do it. And this is how always we're going to do it. And others simply said, you know what? Yeah, I can adopt something that's temporary. I don't agree with it, but I can do it during the season because, quote unquote, let's use the book of Esther, for such a time as this is what must be done. And I think those are some of the things that we're learning in regards to not only church planning, but again, the mission of God as it's unfolding through the work of the church in our cultural context today.
What opportunities are there for church planting in a post-COVID era?
Yeah, so as I mentioned already, the needs are tremendous. The sad reality is that before the pandemic, we were still not keeping up with population growth. And so, churches and communities are placed in an area where we see, again, a post-Christian culture, a post-Christian country. And so the needs were already present. If we believe the Barna research, which, I don't think it may be that high, but if it's 1 out of 5, again, that gap is going out farther. And, one of my convictions is, again, if we look at Matthew 9, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. The harvest is still plentiful. I still believe God is building his church. The gates of Hades shall not be able to prevail against it. So to have kind of these strong convictions in terms of realizing kind of how we engage in church planning, the needs are absolutely at the highest possibility for us to be able to see, maybe at least within my lifetime, in terms of number of people that we have an opportunity to see them as a mission field. And the reality is that unfortunately, I think the wave of church planning, which I would say started, let's say, late 1999s to early 2000s, I feel like it's on a decline in terms of movement. So I think there was a movement in the US that was saying, hey, let's try to actually plant churches to keep up with this need. But I feel like with a lot of the failures of church plants, and I would even argue the moral failures of Christian leaders, especially in the church planting world, there's a little bit of a timidity to say, is church planting really the next thing that we need? I'm going to double down and say yes, because it's kind of like old wineskins, new wineskins, new wineskins for a new generation to reach as many for the sake of Christ. So if some of your listeners or people that are listening on this podcast or interview, I would just simply say, if you're praying or considering church planting, the Lord needs more churches, gospel-bearing churches. I love it when I went to, I think it was Cuba on this one short-term mission trip. And I was meeting with a group of people and they were like, we're praying about raising up funds and money to be able to go to the U.S. as missionaries. And the reason why I love that story is because, we were there as quote unquote short-term missionaries, but they were like, no, in as much as we need the gospel, and that's true, they realized that there were missional needs within their country. They're like, as I read about America, you need Jesus as much as we do. And so they're like, we're trying to send up workers to go there because we see unreached people. And that's where I think that's the message for church planting. If we can have eyes to be able to see, the harvest is by all means plentiful. Let's continue to raise up workers. Let's continue to raise up churches that bear the gospel to reach many for Christ.
I don't know. It's quite interesting that you mentioned this. One Professor Jacob Olupona has propagated the whole idea of reverse mission, that the ones who were, the ones who first took the gospel to certain nations, to some nations, there is a reversal to that you see, like what we like. I don't like the expression, the name third world countries, but just for the purposes of this, I will use that to say that you are now seeing, like, some of these nations that we are, that 100 years ago or so, the gospel went from the West to some of these countries. They are actually the ones engaged in mission now. And, what do you make of this whole idea of do they call it, I'm not a missions person, so correct me if I'm wrong. Is it the 2020 windows or something like that?
The 2040, I think. I forgot.
2040.
Yeah, so I think, are you referencing saying that the 2040 window is now looking to reverse that and saying that they're also trying to send missionaries to the U.S.? Is that, yeah. So, I think generally speaking, and I'll give another example. I can't mention his name, but we have a student who, was part of that 1040 window from a country that's closed, it's a Muslim country that's closed to Christians. And yet he's studying, here at Covenant Seminary through online as he's a refugee in a different country. And, the more every time I get to talk to this brother, the more he hears about the U.S., although he has a burden to go back to his home country to reach people with the gospel, he also feels as though, again, our country, or the U.S., desperately needs, quote unquote, gospel-bearing Christians and leaders to be able to also propagate the gospel, or to be able to share the gospel here as well.
Many of us feel that way.
We do. And that's where, again, I do think it's, there's a reality of the need for that. And we're probably going to see that, the ebbs and flows of quote unquote nations that we have once deemed to be Christian, to see them enter into post-Christendom rather quickly. So, I could use the U.S. context, where I think it's gone from quote unquote a form of Christendom to post-Christendom, that I think is actually going to be a helpful corrective that's necessary for the church. Obviously, we see in Europe, a lot of those countries have gone from quote unquote Christendom or Christian nations to post-Christian nations, and we see kind of the effect of that. If I can use my own heritage, right, in Korea, at one point where they were the largest sending missions country, right, in the world, I would argue that the decline of the church in Korea presently will be sharper than that of the U.S. I'm going to at least argue, at least somewhat conjecture, like there's some conjecture here, meaning you're going to see these huge mega churches in Korea that I think will soon dissipate quicker than you've seen them here in the United States. And I think largely because of the fact that there's always been that guise. And so Christian nationalism in any way, shape, or form is never helpful, because I think it places the church at in an area to be able to say, we can be comfortable and lax and oftentimes preach a gospel that's not the gospel, right? And I think that's the case of the U.S., right? The gospel is what? If you've kind of followed the research, most people will say the gospel that's preached from most pulpits in America is like having a genie in the sky that when we are in trouble, we can rub the lamp and he comes down and he helps us. There's no idea of lordship. There's no idea of his sovereignty. There's no idea of trust and living out on mission, et cetera, and things like that. So there's a counter gospel or an anti-gospel that needs to be corrected. In Korea, it's the same thing. And not to make this too sensitive for you, Seth, but I know Nigeria is not completely reached, but even every country where there's a Christian witness, I think, is in danger of this when we get to the point where we think we can stop relaxing, we can stop being engaged on mission. the places that have been the healthiest have always said, you know what, we realize that when we're in that kind of minority / even, let's say, persecuted, the church has often thrived. And so let's continue to live in a place where we live out of our faith, right? Where we can say that we can see that and not get too lax and comfortable in saying, what does it mean for us to be the proper Christian witness in the world that we live in?
That is so powerful. What a wonderful way to wrap this up. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for making time. I know you are very busy, for making time to just have this interesting conversation. I really appreciate you for your time.
Thank you, Seth, for having me, and thank you for this opportunity just to share thoughts, and pray it be a blessing to you and to your listeners.
Thank you so much for all of you that followed us in this conversation. Thank you so much for doing so. Until I come your way next time with another interesting episode of The Interview. Bye for now.